Alright, welcome everyone. We're going to take a look at a Chiaroscuro drawing of a jingle bell. So you can see here at the beginning I'm laying in a very loose drawing, taking a look at a sphere that can be then essentially made into a little more of a squared form at times. So I have an impression where that jingle bell seems to be kind of pushed, and you get those diagonals developing a kind of implied rectangle on that form. And as I look at an X through that box, I'm looking at how that transitions around the form and where it feels flatter and where it seems to kind of bend a little bit more. This back little fold here has a subtle angle I'm looking at, and there's a center point within that box that everything seems to point to. And right now I'm being very loose about it. I'm not putting in a lot of pressure. So the pencil is easily erased if there's an error or I need to change something. So it's all being laid down with an HB, your typical number 2 pencil essentially, where it's not super hard, it's not super soft, it's that spot in the middle. And so I'm really trying to evaluate the shape, the negative space, the space in between where the metal is folded, so the opening in there. How is it thicker? How is it thinner? So that front one that's more visible as it comes towards us is thicker. When we look at the ones going more diagonally from bottom left to upper right, in that direction up there, it's much more foreshortened, so it's a thinner gap or space in there. Laying in a real quick, loose interpretation of the ribbon that's attached to it. I would say that the focus is a lot more on the metallic form here, but I wanted to give it a sense of purpose. Just a jingle bell sitting on the table doesn't have as much interest as something that has a different kind of reflective property on the ribbon versus the one that's on the metal. And it's really important to kind of keep an eye on how things recede behind something. So I just corrected that form so it felt like it really went in behind on the ribbon. Now I'm laying in a quick shadow form just to lay the shape down and putting as much attention on that shape as really the figure itself. Now I'm using 6B pencil to go in and spot the darks, meaning that I'm going to key and sort of set how dark is this graphite range allowed, because it's not charcoal. It's certainly not going to be able to go a flat matte black like you can find with charcoal. And it's a very rough texture, because the sharpness of the pencil that I have now is not part of that original 6B. That 6B is a very blunt instrument. So I laid in loose and rough at the beginning and build it a little more sharply. And now I'm looking at a 4B with that sharp pencil, comparing to a grayscale, which I've set up with my graphite pencils already. And that grayscale is something that I sort of adjust off of relative to the subject matter, because we can't get to full black. So if I'm looking at something that's in the shadow there being a 90%, I might shoot for 80% with graphite. So I'm laying in that wash of graphite and changing directions. These are short strokes, kind of in looping form. I'm not scribbling, even though the speed up process here kind of makes it look like that. As much as I can, I'm feathering those edges so that when you lay that stroke down, it's not building up heavier in the overlap areas. You see a little bit of, but this is just the first coat. So I want to get a flat kind of tone in there. And I want to keep an eye on how sharp my pencil is. So it was sharp at the beginning. If it dulls out, I want to go back and sharpen it pretty regularly so that there is a consistency to how my mark is applied. Now I'm looking at taking that same 4B here and laying in shadow shapes and shadow areas as a first pass. Very loose, very rough, kind of one direction at this point. and then shifting a little bit as it needs to blend. A little transition. And I'll consistently kind of jump around, if only to move the eye off of something I've been looking at for a little bit and come back to it with somewhat fresh eyes. It also ensures that the piece is receiving attention everywhere, and you haven't spent an hour on something that you only have time now to spend 15 minutes on the rest of it. So if I build it up kind of with this wash over lots of things, washes over multiple areas before I get fully detailed and specific in any one area, that allows me to better disperse my time. So I'm getting a little more precise in here. My pencil's nice and sharp. While that's still sharp, I'll go in and clean up the edge. Make that edge as precise as I want. I'm pretty happy with where the points meet in there and what that shape is making. I want to look at where it's darkest in there, because there is a little bit of a gradient within the bell. It's darker near that circle opening at the bottom, darker at the X in the middle. It sort of brightens in the center. When I'm laying in these next washes, it's just like another layer. It's another layer, like a multiply layer in Photoshop. I'm just building up on top of the primary layer, that first layer of shadow. The cast shadow has a little gradient to it for sure. And as I move back to the ribbon, first step, create that gradient. I'm making assessments relative to that grayscale again, just to double check things. Keep an eye on it. There is some lost and found in the value relationships on the ribbon, where the ribbon disappears into the shadow, if you will. They're almost the same value. I think that's an interesting component here. So there's a sharp focus somewhere, then it loses that focus somewhere else. And because it's not the primary emphasis of the drawing, it's also useful to keep that focus on the bell. So the darkest darks, the highest contrast are going to be on that bell, even if I'm pushing towards some of the darker darks back here. And really that's what, again, I'm doing. I'm spotting the darks, hitting a mid-tone as a first wash, transitioning between the shadow side and the light in the middle, halftone, with the halftone meeting towards where that highlight is. And within those bigger, more abstract shapes, I'm looking for smaller shapes. Where does it seem to get darker? So that kind of corner that folds in, there's a little bit of a bright edge around it that I'm looking at. And as I move into these, this is like the third layer in some cases, the pencil point goes down into the paper a little bit more. It starts to change its angle. At the beginning, it's much flatter against the surface, so it really just lays the graphite on top of the peaks of the texture. The angle pushes now into the texture. It's going to sharpen the focus of the grain. It's going to smooth it out, essentially. So it's not as coarse, it's not as rough. It's smaller grain, like smaller sandpaper, higher grit sandpaper. We're pushing the forms here. So it's got a highlight, it's got a halftone, now it's got more of a shadow on the form as it's rolling around. Doing that in here again, comparing that where I'm looking at currently where it's at and where it needs to go. So I'm looking at the grayscale relative to the subject as well. I'll hold it under the light right next to the bell, so that I can say that area right there at the top of that turn of the ribbon needs to go darker. But how dark? So I make an assessment with not just a guess, but with some evidence. As that ribbon controls its turn behind the other one, I want it to fade out a little bit. I want it to be fuzzier, a little softer, a little brighter even. That way it really sinks behind. As the eye shifts towards the piece in front with more contrast. So I'm softening that edge a little bit with a harder pencil. I'm using an H. And this is a 2B, pushing it a little darker. It's pretty sharp right now. I want that edge that's kind of as a T overlap with the relationship behind it to come forward. Cleaning things up. Everything that I've done really now, except for maybe the darkest darks, could be erased with not too much difficulty. I'm not pushing in too hard. I'm really letting that surface stay usable. Comparing relationships, how much of a jump from the halftone there right between the shadow and the light do I need? How much change? So I'm pushing that light back. It's not pure white. It needs to be a value of some kind. And I'm going to leave that one a little lighter anyway because it's going to be in the distance. Even if that distance is only a few inches, it's the thing that's furthest back. I want a little reduction in contrast there so that the areas of primary interest have the most contrast. They come forward in space because of that. But you can see, again, I've put time and effort into the bell. I've started to put time and effort into the ribbon. If I were doing a full drawing with multiple objects, I would be doing the same thing. I'd be bringing up to a similar level really the whole piece, and then continue to go into it with more detail. That, again, allows you to make really conscious decisions with the time that you have available to your drawing. Here I'm being very precise on the edge because the metal has a thickness. I want that little highlight edge to be there. And I'm comparing now what that relationship of value change is on the reflected light. It's easy to oversee into reflections, and so it's important to be able to assess a relationship. That highlight is pure white on top. This is reflected table surface. So if you look at that relationship, the reflection has to be darker. It's not as intense. It's not receiving the reflection of the light source. It's receiving the reflection of a table surface that is illuminated. And there's a definite fall off of intensity because of that distance that it's traveling. It's bouncing off of something. The light loses intensity. The bell has to cast a shadow onto the ribbon, so I need to introduce that. I'm sharpening the cast shadow underneath the ribbon. It will be sharper there than the edge around the bell as I develop that a little further. And as this form here is bending around, it's got a kind of core shadow, though that's not really what it is. It's a little bit of a bend in the metal, so some of it's going to receive more of a reflection on that top edge. Some of it's receiving more of the reflection of the darker space that I'm sitting in right now, which essentially is what that abstract shape is. That light shape that ebbs across the bottom edge is the edge of the table. The table is white. It's sitting on something that will reflect into it, and then the darkened space around my light source that's reflecting in there. So there's essentially three values, and then there'll be gradients within those. We've got a nice core shadow, and a nice little thin edge on the front that again will give it some thickness and dimension. And in that space between those, I'm able to still see some air, some gap. I can see the table through it. So I have this very foreshortened view of something that wraps around the cylinder or sphere here. That back left edge has a softness to it. It's reflecting, again, the surrounding around it, but if it was defined as something really sharp, it would start to come forward, and I want it to fade behind. I want that thickness of the piece of metal to come forward. That point of the triangle, if you will. And I'm giving some refinement, giving a little critical assessment on that edge that I made there, and saying it wasn't the right angle yet. Refining that thickness here again. It doesn't have a huge highlight, and so there is the need to tone it very lightly as it fades around, but I still want it to be sharp at the beginning and then slowly soften off. So I'm trying to be really attentive to edges and think about how edges can adjust relative to their space. Something that's in the foreground will be sharper, something that's rolling away from the eye can be softened. And so here, again, I'm taking that larger abstract shape, breaking it down into an abstract S-curve or Z shape in there. And really that's because those shapes within the reflections are going to be softer. We're able to see into that space, but we don't want to oversee. As I'm looking at the cast shadow on the ground, I'm trying to smooth it out a little bit. I'll pay attention to how it grades in terms of dark to light, darker right underneath where it's blocked, or the occlusion shadow of the bell onto that surface. It's darker there, it's going to anchor to that surface. It'll get brighter as the distance increases from the object that's casting it. So the top point there, you can see the shape of the cast shadow kind of looks like a wrench. That opening that's visible in how it separates on the bell is much further away than the point on the right, kind of at the base of that shape of the shadow. That'll be a little firmer, and as you see it move over to the right, it's going to be a little firmer even still. And then in contrast on the ribbon, that'll be a sharper edge, because that is almost laying on the ground perfectly. So you look for that variation along the edge of your cast shadows as well. You'll see it soften as we go a little bit more. And in doing that, I'm using a slightly harder pencil. This would be a B and a 2B. Right now, here's a 2B that I would use over top of that original 4B to smooth it out. A little more angle again into the surface of the material, the paper material. And jumping back into here. So I want to give myself fresh eyes to come back into this again, so that those abstract shapes can be really attentively seen, that I'm not trying to make something up that I think is in there. I want to really observe what is happening, pay attention to those shapes. As this edge here is moving towards the ribbon, I want it to be darker, but I don't necessarily want it to be razor sharp. And that's again partially because it's further away. It's not on the front plane of the bell, it's on the back corner. But I do want it to be darker than the ribbon so that it comes forward and off of it a little bit. So there is an evidence almost of a coarse shadow where that back corner, if you will, is a little brighter than that darker kind of stripe on the bell itself. And I'll be emphasizing that darkness a little bit more here. And just like on a regular spherical object that has a really strong core shadow, you can pick that up on our Jingle bell here as well. As you look at metallic objects in your composition, you can think of them as really reflecting the world. So whatever you have set up in there in terms of value range, you're more than likely to find on something reflective. The thing that changes that certainly is if the metal is worn, if it's going to be a little less shiny reflective and more matte reflective. That's going to vary how dark something might get on it. But something that's really mirror finish is going to get a pretty strong dark, really strong bright, and pretty much the world in between it, a whole range of values. And really, I'm changing direction here, but I'm emphasizing the diagonal that moves from top left to bottom right. I'm emphasizing that diagonal that describes the form, and I do that anyway, but there's also a few like striations and stripes of very thin lines on the metal. So it has intent in two ways for sure. Anything that's in there, I want it to stay within a dark range. Again, so it's easy to oversee, it's easy to look in there and say, I want that bright highlight, and I'm going to go and take the eraser at it. But that eraser is going to change the texture, it's going to like smear. It's also going to make it more bright than you want, brighter than you want to. So if we can be thoughtful about building around and towards the highlights, it'll feel like it's connected to that surface a little bit more. When I say highlights, but it's really a halftone, a mid-tone in those shadow shapes. And then when I build something a little darker in the foreground, I'll look to the back edge and say, does something need to go darker here? It's all of a sudden changed in terms of its relationship with the original one. So I'm continuing to assess, continuing to look at my grayscale, continuing to look at the ribbon compared to the reflected side here, reflected light bouncing off the table. And transitioning this now so that it has a little form, because it's a little flat right now. It has a little bit of a lost edge, but I'm changing direction because I have multiple directions going on in the shadow areas. I need that to be consistent into the brighter areas, or it'll feel like it's a different surface. So I do want to kind of match my texture a bit. And I'll be doing this with much harder pencils. These are HB pencils, H pencil right now even. And I'm using my grayscale to assess which pencil weight to choose based on my previous experience. So if you haven't done a grayscale before, to kind of figure out what your hand is comfortable doing, how much pressure you apply to get a tone, you really should practice that beforehand. Have a little test page of swatches where you've burnished that H down really hard versus something a little softer. Try to match that H value with something softer, like a 6B, because you can do that. It's just going to have a very different texture. Knowing what your tools will do for you is a huge part of being confident down the road. So when you know what it'll do, you're not going to be thinking too much about it. You're just going to know, I need this pencil here. So this is like the fourth pass at least over top of this. Continuing to find other shapes, add a little more specificity, varnish the dark down a little bit more. Again, in comparison to that center opening, so it's not quite as dark. I want it to sit on the foreground edge. Likewise, doing the same thing here. Some more final passes. Transitioning that halftone towards the reflection. There's this little bit of an edge that feels brighter on the bottom contour, but I'm leaving it soft, so it's not a thickness. I don't want it to feel like one of those really thin, fine highlight lines on the folded metal. It's got to have a softness change or an edge change. These are detail moments. These final passes in certain areas are very important to be thinking while you're doing it, and not just mindlessly going after things. So this is bouncing around, trying to fill in little moments, not taking broad strokes. They're more precise. Definitely done with harder pencils than the original 4B, and usually more of an angled point down into the texture with a sharp pencil. Hopefully you'll pay attention to the sharpness of that pencil throughout this. That it is almost needlepoint sharp. I want that texture in my work, the paper texture, so I know it's a drawing. But I also want to be able to get into the paper texture as much as I can. I'm going to spend some time working towards the ribbon, emphasizing edges. That edge now is sharper, so it comes forward. There are relationships between the shadow side and the reflection that I want to make a relationship here where it's a little darker right there. And then when I darken that reflected light on that green ribbon needs to just be dimmed a little bit more so it stays in the shadow area. A couple little moments in there, start playing with the texture of the edge and the texture of the ribbon itself, which is slightly varied. It's got stripes in it at a very minute scale, so when I look at those, I will use them to kind of guide some of the direction in the mark making. But they're primarily focused in terms of being able to be seen by the viewer. They're focused on that transition between that highlight and the core shadow. That's where the texture shows up most, because that's where that light is raking across the surface, and it's going to pick up on the highlights. It's going to pick up on the high points, rather, on the peaks of the texture, and let the valleys and the shadows fill in around them, so you get more contrast there. I'm always looking for things to be in focus and then out of focus, so it's a sharper edge near that connection of the ribbon to the ground. It's fuzzier over here. That ribbon is lofted off the surface, so it has a softness to it. Toning back that highlight because it's not a pure white highlight, it's got some green in it. I think I do end up leaving it a little brighter anyway, just to let it sink back a little bit more. Toning that one back a little bit. You can certainly see kind of cross-contour, cross-hatching almost in the ribbon there. That'll bring that edge forward as well. That surface has more texture to it compared to the ribbon behind it. Not that the ribbon behind it doesn't have some stripes and lines on it, but just that there is a little bit more focus on it, more observational kind of interest in that texture, so it will grab the eye and bring it forward a little bit. Second pass over this kind of conclusion to the ribbon and pushing the darks further, playing with that edge of the shadow. Again, it's sharper where it meets the base of that ribbon, which is very foreshortened. There's this little flare outward, little kind of shadow out there. Sinking this back, something was too bright. Always good to make sure that it stays in that space. Adjusting the shadow edge a little bit more, softening a bit. Cleaning an edge up, wants to be a little sharper there, because it's closer to the ribbon that's casting it. Much softer out there, because it's lofted away. Again, continuing to assess relationships. It was still just a little too bright compared to that highlight on the bell. Areas in there, standing out a little too much, softening them back, darkening them back. Even on reflected objects, you want to make that comparison. There's a lot of intensity, seemingly, where you would feel like you want to use your eraser and lift out a reflection in that shadow side, but be really attentive to the contrast. An eraser will almost always be too much, so you want to work around that value as much as you can. And here I'm going through and just knocking the paper white back a little bit. I want the surface, again, to feel like it's a little bit less intensely bright than that highlight on the bell. So this is an H pencil, very light pressure, almost just letting the weight of the pencil itself drag across the surface. Using a directional hatch, it's very faint, that will sink that ground back, and it will actually help get away from some of the figure ground reversal you might have in a negative space between the ribbon. With the final look at the scan, hopefully you can still see the subtle gradient across the ground. While not being really blatant, it just gives it a little bit of surface for the bell to rest on and to move with that light source. And I hope you've had a good time watching this, picked up some tips, and good luck with all of your drawings in the future.